She is the only person to blame. She is the one that flagrantly fouled Sophie Cunningham, taking her out of the air. And she is the one that went and posted white privilege afterwards, which was the, gas on the flame.
That right there is the moment this stops being about one hard foul and starts becoming a much bigger question. When one player keeps ending up at the center of the same kind of controversy, how many times can everybody keep calling each incident isolated?
I've used the term reckless or dirty, and they're cousins, right? Like, you want to call it reckless, you can call it reckless. You want to call it dirty, I can understand you calling it dirty. But Carrington continues to have plays that fall into that category.
And notice the distinction being made here, because it matters. There is a difference between saying somebody is intentionally trying to injure opponents and saying their style of play has become so reckless that dangerous contact keeps following them around. Those are not the same accusation. But from the perspective of the player taking the hit, that distinction eventually starts feeling pretty academic. That is where the argument around DiJonai Carrington has changed. This is no longer one frozen frame circulating after one fever game. The criticism is increasingly about accumulation. Contact to the head, hands around faces, players getting knocked out of the air, controversy immediately spilling onto social media. Then, days later, another sequence that looks familiar enough for people to ask the same question all over again. And that question is uncomfortable for the WNBA, because there are really two issues hiding inside it. The first is player safety. The second is credibility. If officials, coaches, teams, and the league keep treating every new incident as though it exists completely separate from everything that came before it, fans are eventually going to stop accepting that explanation. But there is another piece of this story that becomes even more damaging later, because it is not about another foul at all. It is about what happened when Carrington pointed towards somebody sitting in the stands, and what the team reportedly determined afterward.
Here against the Valkyries last night, why is the left hand coming down on the face there? Right into the eye. How many different times have we seen DiJonai Carrington specifically poke a player in the eye? It is a patented move. At some point, is it how can you continue to say an accident when it continues to happen? Or it's just you're so reckless that you can't control.
That replay is exactly why the debate refuses to die. Forget motive for a second and look at the mechanical question. Why does the hand keep ending up across somebody's face? Basketball is chaotic. Hands fly. Bodies collide. Players reach across driving lanes and miss time contests. Anybody pretending accidental facial contact never happens is being ridiculous. Of course it happens. The problem begins when the same player's name repeatedly becomes attached to the same kind of contact. One accident tells you almost nothing. Two makes you notice. Once a recognizable pattern forms, history naturally changes the way every new play gets evaluated. That happens in every sport. A player known for late tackles gets less benefit of the doubt on the next borderline tackle. A pitcher with a history of hitting batters inside gets scrutinized when another fastball rides too far in. Reputation is not supposed to replace evidence, but reputation absolutely affects interpretation. That is why simply saying, "That's how she plays," cannot be the end of the discussion. If how somebody plays repeatedly creates dangerous outcomes, then the style itself becomes relevant. Physical basketball is legal. Reckless basketball is still subject to penalties. Those categories cannot be blurred just because somebody is aggressive. And Carrington does deserve one point of fairness here. Nobody looking at a video clip can read her mind. You can argue a play was unnecessary. You can argue the movement was reckless. You can even argue officials should punish it more severely. But declaring intent requires evidence we usually do not have. The stronger criticism does not need mind reading. It is simpler. If similar outcomes keep happening, the responsibility is on the player to adjust.
And that's why, even when it was said she didn't do whatever the play to Sophie on purpose, which I don't exactly buy considering how, the ball was already out and how over the top the contact was, but I can at least entertain the concept given DiJonai Carrington's history. And that's where the Stephanie White comment comes into play too, because I know you coached her. That's fine. But when you say that's the way she plays, as if that's okay. That's what, the punishments should be easier to hand out when there are repeated instances.
That Stephanie White comment is important because it gets to the heart of how coaches talk about physical players. Coaches love competitors who play on the edge. They want defenders attacking the ball, fighting through screens, contesting everything, and refusing to give opponents comfortable possessions. But there is a line between explaining somebody's identity and excusing everything that comes with it. Saying a player is naturally physical can explain why contact happens more often. It does not erase responsibility for controlling that contact. And that becomes especially sensitive when the league is already dealing with intense scrutiny over officiating. Fans have spent season after season arguing that one player gets one whistle, another gets a different whistle, and certain incidents become major news only depending on who was involved. Whether every one of those complaints is fair almost becomes secondary. The perception itself becomes a problem once enough people believe enforcement is inconsistent. That is why consistency matters more than protecting anybody's reputation. If a foul deserves a flagrant, call it. If it deserves a common foul, call that. If repeat behavior reaches the level where additional discipline is warranted under league rules, handle it there. But the standard has to be understandable. Because once the audience gets the impression that history counts for some players, but suddenly becomes irrelevant for others, every future whistle becomes another argument instead of an answer.
And that wasn't the only eye poke in the one game. It's the same game. Tiffany Hayes this time. Right across the face, no ball. That was just whistled a common foul on the floor. But that's, 2 rakes across the face in the same game. From a player we've seen obviously do that. Obviously, she did it to Caitlin Clark. I'm not going to call it a race thing there. You got a white player and a black player. This is a DiJonai thing, right? I'm talking about a DiJonai thing.
And now the argument gets harder to dismiss because according to this breakdown, it was not just one face contact sequence in that game. Tiffany Hayes was involved in another. That does not automatically make either play intentional. It does, however, make random accident a less satisfying explanation when similar incidents keep clustering around one player. This is where the conversation needs to resist getting dragged into every larger cultural fight people want to attach to it. The cleanest version of this criticism is not racial, and it is not political. It is basketball specific. Is Carrington consistently playing with enough control to protect opponents from unnecessary contact to the head and face? That question can be asked whether the opponent is white, black, famous, anonymous, a superstar, or the 12th player off the bench. In fact, removing all of those identities makes the argument stronger because the standard becomes universal. And that is also why turning criticism of a specific play into a broad ideological dispute can backfire. Fans who believe they are looking at a straightforward basketball issue start feeling like the actual footage is being avoided. Then everybody stops debating the foul and starts debating what they think the foul symbolizes. The league cannot possibly win that game. It can control what happens between the lines. It can establish a predictable standard for excessive contact. It can make sure referees evaluate the play rather than the personality, and players can make sure their own conduct does not keep creating openings for the same controversy. That is the part Carrington controls herself.
Woman thing, not a white privilege thing. But, that's what makes the white privilege post so infuriating, too, is that DiJonai can do this stuff, not receive any blowback or punishment for it, and even be protected. That you know, how does that, like, how is that okay?
Now we reach the social media part, and this is where the temperature around Carrington rises beyond ordinary basketball criticism. After the Sophie Cunningham incident, Carrington posted white privilege. Whatever broader point she intended to communicate, the timing ensured that people connected the message to the controversy that had just exploded around the foul. Instead of cooling down a dispute over whether a basketball play crossed the line, the post poured an entirely different argument into it. That matters from a branding perspective because professional leagues do not operate only on technical correctness. They operate on public trust. A league can survive villains. Sports actually benefit from players fans love to hate. Rivalries sell tickets. Conflict creates interest. Nobody needs the WNBA to become sanitized or personality-free. But there is a major difference between being a compelling antagonist and repeatedly creating situations that make fans question whether the rules are being applied consistently. That is the real brand risk. It is not that every player must be universally liked. That would be impossible and boring. It is that audiences need to believe the competition itself is being governed seriously. When the conversation becomes, would another player have gotten away with that? Or, why is this being dismissed again? The damage is not limited to Carrington. The skepticism starts spreading toward officials, coaches, and the league. And that is before we even get to what happened courtside.
And that's not it. She also pointed out a fan, right? Like, there was this exchange in the game to the ref. I was watching all this live, and I'm just like, oh, here we go again. I'm going to have to deal with this. I'm going to have to talk about it. So I don't know what she said. It's this guy. He didn't seem to be too worried about whatever he said. And then he winds up, the security comes over. They point him out here, as you see. And they wind up taking the dude away. You see, like, he's like, all right. And he gets up and leaves with them.
This is where we have to be extremely careful, because nobody outside the immediate situation should invent what that fan said. If somebody in the crowd used racist, hateful, threatening, or abusive language, remove them immediately. Athletes do not lose their right to basic dignity because somebody bought an expensive seat. There is no legitimate argument against enforcing a real fan conduct policy, but there is a second responsibility attached to that power. Complaints have to be investigated seriously, because removing somebody from a sporting event is a significant action. Security cannot simply assume that pointing at a fan proves misconduct occurred, and that is why what happened after this moment is more important than the initial reaction. Carrington alerted officials. Security approached the man. He left his seat. At that instant, people watching from home had no idea what had been said, and they should not have pretended they did. The proper process is exactly what you would want. Separate the parties, find out what happened, speak to the people involved, then determine whether the arena's code was violated. The result of that process is what changes this story from another tense player-fan exchange into a credibility problem.
One, again, yeah, any fan who's completely out of pocket or says anything racist, hateful, whatever, over the line should be kicked out of the game. No problem with that. We see that in sports all the time. But in the WNBA now, it's starting to become a pattern where fans are being pointed out. I mean, because this is going to be the second instance once I show you what the Valkyries said about it, where a fan is pointed out by a player, and then a team is like, no, that wasn't worth it. So you lose the power of that. Like, people stop taking you seriously if you're pointing fans out and trying to get them kicked out over something the teams say wasn't worthy.
That warning is bigger than it sounds. Player safety does not stop at the baseline. Fans can absolutely cross lines, and sports history gives us more than enough examples of players being subjected to disgusting behavior from people in the stands. When athletes raise a legitimate complaint, officials need to respond quickly. But that system only works if everybody trusts the complaints are being handled according to an actual standard. If fans start believing that disagreement, ordinary heckling, or criticism can get them removed simply because a player points them out, trust collapses. At the same time, if players believe arenas will ignore legitimate abuse because officials are afraid of overreacting, their trust collapses too. So the goal should not be believe every fan or believe every player. The goal should be investigate every serious complaint and enforce the rule based on what actually happened. That is why the follow-up from the Valkyries matters so much. We finally get something beyond speculation.
Last night, DiJonai Carrington alerted officials of a fan who was escorted from his seat but later allowed return. A Golden State Valkyrie team official told me the fan was cooperative after a complaint that was unfounded. Unfounded. Sky PR declined to comment on what transpired but said the fan was given a warning.
And that phrase, "that's just DiJonai," is exactly the mindset the league cannot afford. Because once repeated conduct becomes normalized as somebody's personality, enforcement gets backwards. History should make officials more alert to recurring dangerous behavior, not less concerned by it. Think about what defenders of Carrington might reasonably say. She plays hard. She is emotional. She has become an easy target because of previous controversies. Clips can make ordinary basketball contact look worse in slow motion. Social media rewards outrage, so every interaction gets exaggerated. Every one of those points deserves consideration, but none of them solves the central issue. If you are constantly appearing in clips where opponents take contact to the head or face, the solution cannot forever be that everyone else needs to stop noticing. At some point, the player has to adjust. That does not mean becoming passive. It means controlling the hands. It means recognizing where an opponent is in the air. It means understanding that reputation gives you less margin for another borderline play. Great defenders adapt to officiating all the time. Players adjust how they contest shots, how they navigate screens, how they use their arms, and how aggressively they challenge somebody above the shoulders. That is part of being a professional, and the same principle applies off the floor. When you know your social media is being watched, you can still say whatever you believe, but you cannot act surprised when provocative messages become part of how the public evaluates your judgment. Freedom to speak does not mean freedom from people forming an opinion about what you said. There is also a business consequence here that cannot be ignored. The WNBA is trying to turn increased attention into long-term fans. Those viewers are deciding whether they trust the product enough to keep watching after the current wave of interest settles. People will tolerate controversial personalities. They will tolerate rivalries. They will tolerate hard fouls. What they do not tolerate for very long is the feeling that outcomes depend on selective standards. If one fan gets approached after a complaint that is later described as unfounded, viewers remember it. If another fan controversy happens days apart, viewers compare them. If physical incidents repeatedly involve the same player, viewers connect those two. You cannot demand that an audience erase its memory every time a new game starts.
So, in this case, you've got two eye rakes and an unfounded fan accusation in the same game from DiJonai Carrington less than a week since she flagrantly fouled Sophie Cunningham out of the air and posted white privilege on her social media account. And if I had to guess, it's just fine, right? That's just DiJonai. That's just her. That's not a problem.
And this is where the protect the brand argument turns back on itself. Protecting a league's brand does not mean shielding players from criticism. It does not mean declaring uncomfortable stories off limits. It definitely does not mean choosing which controversies deserve examination based on whether the discussion is convenient. Protecting the brand means protecting confidence in the competition. That means a superstar should be judged under the same rulebook as a role player. A popular player should be judged under the same rulebook as an unpopular one. A player with millions of defenders online should not get a different interpretation than somebody with no social media army at all. And when there is ambiguity, say there is ambiguity. That is actually healthier than pretending every disputed play has an obvious answer. Maybe a hand to the face was accidental. Fine. Then call it accidental while still acknowledging it was dangerous. Maybe a hard foul was not intended to injure anybody. Fine. Intent and consequence are different questions. Maybe a player genuinely believed a fan crossed the line even though arena officials later determined the complaint was unfounded. That is possible too. Nuance does not weaken accountability. It makes accountability credible. The worst outcome for the WNBA would be creating two camps where one side has to pretend Carrington has never done anything questionable, and the other side has to pretend every contact she makes is a calculated attack. Neither version is serious. The serious version is to examine the pattern, judge each incident on its own evidence, then ask whether the pattern itself deserves a response.
That's not okay. Again, nobody should be treated unfairly. Nobody should be punished more harshly than others relative to whatever, unless there is I could see a history leading into that. But you lose me a little bit when the pushback is so like, let's stop focusing on this when so many other stuff has been focused on in the past that was much more benign. Or, we got to protect the brand. And is that who you want representing the brand?
And that is ultimately the question this whole story leaves sitting on the league's desk. How many times can similar moments happen before coincidence stops being a complete explanation? Nobody needs the WNBA to manufacture a punishment because the internet is angry. That would be just as bad as ignoring behavior because the internet is divided. The standard should be basketball, evidence, and consistency. If Carrington's contact is repeatedly judged legal or merely common foul territory, then the league should be prepared to defend that standard consistently when somebody else plays the exact same way. If officials believe the pattern crosses into excessive or reckless behavior, then enforce the rules accordingly. And if fan complaints are made, investigate them every time. Protect players when abuse actually happens, but also protect spectators from being treated as guilty before anybody knows what was said. That is how you protect a brand. Not by shutting down criticism, not by pretending controversy disappears if you refuse to engage with it, and not by reducing every debate to whichever cultural argument is trending that day. You protect the brand by making the audience believe the same rules apply tomorrow that applied yesterday. Carrington is talented enough that this discussion should be about her basketball. Instead, the conversation keeps getting pulled toward dangerous contact, social media fallout, and confrontations that force teams to issue explanations afterward. Some people will say that makes her a villain, and villains are good for sports. Others will say the pattern has moved beyond entertainment and become something the league needs to address. So which side are you on? Is DiJonai Carrington simply an aggressive player whose every move is now being magnified because of her reputation? Or has the pattern become too consistent for the WNBA to keep treating each controversy like a completely separate accident? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns where we actually look at the footage, the statements, and what happened afterward, instead of just repeating the loudest narrative, like the video and subscribe.
Because that sort of pattern eventually becomes a problem for the WNBA. And sorry, these sort of things just shouldn't be happening as often as they.
There is the payoff. According to the team official quoted in this report, the complaint was determined to be unfounded. The fan cooperated, and he was allowed to return to his seat. Sky Public Relations declined to explain exactly what happened, but said the fan received a warning. That does not prove Carrington fabricated anything. It does not tell us what she believed she heard. It does not establish malicious intent. Those distinctions are important. But it does establish something narrower and still significant. After the complaint was examined, the response was not permanent removal. And when you combine that with the other controversies surrounding Carrington, you start seeing why critics are no longer evaluating each moment inside its own little box. Reputation is cumulative. The basketball plays affect how people interpret the next basketball play. The social posts affect how people interpret the next statement. The fan complaint affects how people interpret the next courtside confrontation. That is not necessarily fair in every individual case, but it is how public credibility works. You build credibility by demonstrating judgment consistently. You lose it when people repeatedly walk away from situations wondering whether your reaction matched what actually happened. And this is where the WNBA faces a much larger decision than whether people personally like DiJonai Carrington. The league is growing under a brighter spotlight than it had for most of its history. More viewers mean more supporters, but they also mean more scrutiny. Plays that might once have disappeared into a Tuesday night box score are now clipped, replayed, slowed down, debated, and circulated to millions of people. That environment demands better consistency from everyone involved: players, referees, coaches, team security, league discipline, media. Everybody. Because once the league wants the attention of mainstream sports fans, it also inherits mainstream sports expectations. Fans are going to compare punishments. They are going to remember previous incidents. They are going to challenge explanations that seem contradictory. They are going to demand evidence when somebody is removed from the stands. And they are going to notice when one organization says a complaint did not justify ejection after everyone online already assumed the worst. That scrutiny is not automatically hostility toward women's basketball.
A growing sports league should want people invested enough to care whether its standards make sense.